Well, good day. We're carrying on our devotions today and looking at some of these different stories of Elisha. And today it's Naaman. You probably heard that story. We're going to look at it again here in 2 Kings chapter 5. So Naaman was the commander of the army of Syria, which was the enemy of Israel. And so he had he had led many a raid against Israel. Um, but he has leprosy. And back then, leprosy was one of the worst things. You became an outcast in society. And so he's dealing with this leprosy. No one was able to cure him. But he has a servant girl, an Israelite, which that means likely he had stolen her, abducted her during one of his raids and brought her back as a slave girl in his household. And despite being that enemy being her abductor, um, she has compassion on him, and she tells her master, the mistress, and says, um, "Have you? What if he? There's a prophet in Israel, Elisha, that could heal him if you went and saw him." And I just paused there, and as I thought more about that, I thought I never really thought about that in this story, but just how amazing it is that this girl was willing to care and have compassion on her master, even though he abducted her, even though took her away from her homeland and made her a slave. Um, she did that, and that just made me kind of ask: how do we look at our enemies? Enemies, those that are different than us. Do we still have the same level of compassion? Um, do we care that they're lost? I think of you know nowadays, what would it be, the left or some of these different groups that we often, I don't know, seem to be so against as a church. But do we have compassion on them? And they need Jesus so much. Um, so Naaman goes and he goes to his king. I mean, he's the king's general. So he goes to the king and says, "Hey, there's a prophet in Israel that can heal me." And so the king says, "Absolutely." The king loves his general, so he'll do anything. So he writes a letter to the king of Israel and says, "I'm sending my general to you to be healed." Well, the king of Israel's like, "What? Like, he's just trying to pick a fight with me. How am I? I cannot. What am I, God, that I can heal people?" And so he's all worried. But Elisha finds out about it and sends word to the king and says, "Send him to me." So Naaman goes to Elisha, and I just want to read these two verses here. Here's kind of how it happens when he arrives at Elisha's house. So he stood at the front door of Elisha's house, and Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought he would surely come out and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure me, the leper." And so he shows up, does all this traveling. He brought a bunch of gifts. He shows up at Elisha's house, and Elisha sends a servant down. Doesn't even go down and talk to himself. This Syrian general um, sends a servant down and says, tell him to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and he'll be healed. And this is where Naaman's pride gets in the way, and he's offended. It's not the way he thought it was going to go down. And he's ready to go home. He's ready to ride off home. And one of his servants um, comes and says, like, "Hey, Naaman, like, he didn't ask you to do a hard thing. If he'd asked you to do a way harder thing, you probably would have done it. This is simple. Just go wash in the river. Why not? Why not try it? You know." And so Naaman does, and of course he's healed. And he comes back, and this for me was kind of the crux of the passage, and just a reminder of here Naaman has lived with this terrible disease. He would have been avoided by many people, and he's willing to go all the way to Israel and go to his king and bring tons, what would be equivalent of millions of dollars in gifts. Um, and he brings all these, and the prophet asks him to do one simple thing, and his pride gets in the way. and he's unwilling to do it until a servant talks to him and reminds him, helps him to open his eyes to what he's doing. And I just ask myself, do we ever let our pride get in the way of what God's trying to do, just because he's asking us to do it in some way that we think is beneath us, or not the way we expected, or not the way we would like? It's uncomfortable, or yeah, like do we do that? And God's looking to work and do amazing things, but we're don't allow it. We don't want it because it's not how we thought God should do it. And so that was what I took out of that and was challenged by that as I was studying it. And so Naaman tries to give Elisha lots of gifts. Elisha refuses and sends him on his way. But Gehazi, that's Elisha's servant, afterwards saw all these gifts, and Elisha just turned them down. And so he chases after Naaman and says, hey, actually, Elisha wants some of those, just a couple. Can we have some? And Naaman's happy to give it to him. He wanted to give it all to him. So he gives Gehazi, and Gehazi takes it home and hides it. And but Elisha, the Lord reveals this to Elisha, and Elisha confronts him for his greed, and he's punished. He actually gets the leprosy that Naaman had because of that deceit and stealing. And just as I step back and look at this, we have two things that often hinder God's work in our lives. We have pride and not being willing to allow God to lead and do it his way. We want to do it our way, or want him to do it our way. And greed, and that's so prevalent in our day, not just with money, but with time and many other things. We want to be selfish and keep it to ourselves, and it often ends up hindering what God is looking to do. And so let that be a challenge to you, and as you go today, would your eyes be open to what God is doing, and let him lead, and seek him, that see what amazing things he'll do through you as you go about your day. God bless.